What happens when an author uses really high literary skill, I mean, genuine verbal energy, as critics called it, to promote a deeply polarizing and, frankly, racist ideology?
Right. We're not talking about some poorly written manifesto here.
No, this is a book that critics praised for its rhetorical power, while at the same time completely condemned for its content.
So how do you even approach a text like that?
That's the question. Today we're doing an in-depth structural analysis of Jean Raspail's infamous 1973 novel, The Camp of the Saints. Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis.
It's more than just a summary.
Way more. We're examining how the author shapes his argument, how he builds influence, and how he earns, or in this case, he loses your trust. The mission is to give you the tools to read with sharper insight.
And greater discernment.
Should you read this book? This should help you decide. It's also, I think, excellent for aspiring writers who want to understand the mechanics of persuasion.
Definitely. And if you find this format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really does guide our future content. And just a quick note for everyone listening. You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Okay, so let's set the stage. What is the central conceit of this novel?
The Camp of the Saints is a French dystopian novel. It's set in a near future from that 1973 perspective.
And the premise is built around this sensational invasion narrative.
That's right. A huge flotilla carrying about 1 million impoverished South Asian refugees is sailing toward the coast of France.
And the whole story is about this journey, their arrival, and the immediate fallout.
And the core idea is that the West is just unable or maybe unwilling to stop it. And this single event triggers the complete collapse of Western civilization.
It's a pretty stark premise.
It is. And you have to understand the historical moment it came from. Raspail was a traditionalist Catholic, a French writer who was firmly on the far right.
So this was a reaction to something happening in the 70s.
Absolutely. It's an apocalyptic response to the anxieties in post-colonial France. They were grappling with decolonization, immigration from former colonies, and for some, this deep sense of cultural decline.
So Raspail just took all those fears and
pushed them to their absolute apocalyptic extreme.
Okay, that context is vital. So let's get into strategy. How did he establish the authority, the ethos, to make such an extreme message? Well, to make it land with a literary readership.
Well, part of his ethos comes directly from his reputation. He was seen as a serious, well-read writer.
Not just a pundit.
No. And even critics who were completely repulsed by the book's ideology had to acknowledge his style. They called it erudite and rhetorically energetic.
So the quality of the prose itself is doing some of the work. It's almost like a shield.
Precisely. That stylistic skill gives an aura of sophistication to what are otherwise really stark racialized binaries.
It stops people from immediately dismissing it as just crude propaganda.
It does. It makes the argument seem more intellectually respectable, or at least a worthwhile literary meditation, which is a key part of the strategy. But it goes deeper.
Okay.
The most crucial move he makes is creating this persona of the courageous truth teller.
Ah, the one person willing to say the uncomfortable thing.
Exactly. He presents himself as the only voice willing to articulate these taboo emotions: resentment of demographic change, fear of losing majority status, things he claims mainstream discourse just suppresses.
So he's inviting the reader into a special club.
He is. He's inviting his implied audience, a Western, white, culturally conservative readership, to see their anxiety not as prejudice,
but as courageous realism.
You've got it. It's a framing exercise. And it's a rhetorical strategy that became incredibly common in later far-right rhetoric.
So the book's stated purpose is to be a warning.
Right. But its deeper function is to normalize an extreme siege mentality. It frames total exclusion as the only rational moral choice left.
Okay, so that's the ethos. But the real engine of this book seems to be emotion. Let's talk pathos. It's famous for generating intense fear and disgust.
Oh, absolutely. The primary technique is just relentless, visceral dehumanization.
Of the migrant.
Of the migrants. The narrative constantly uses this hyperbolic, almost lurid language to paint them not as people, but as a terrifying biological mass.
What are some examples?
Well, you see phrases like an endless cascade of human flesh, or the entire flotilla being compared to an anthill slashed open. It's language designed to strip them of any individuality.
That's incredibly stark. It feels designed to create a physical revulsion, to just shut down any chance of empathy.
It's entirely deliberate. The descriptions just escalate. They're rendered as nameless, faceless, half-naked hordes. Some critics summarize the portrayal as only half-human.
And that's why it's classified as openly racist fiction.
Yes. Once a reader internalizes that imagery, the argument for getting rid of them becomes rhetorically much, much simpler.
But the emotion isn't just directed outward, is it? It seems like there's also this intense resentment aimed inward, at the West's own leaders.
That's the other critical piece of the emotional puzzle. One channel is disgust for the outsider, the other is rage.
Rage at who?
At Western elites. The politicians, the clergy, the intellectuals, they're all portrayed as sentimental, self-loathing, or just spiritually weak.
They're the ones who are letting this happen in the story.
Yes, they're caricatured as welcoming the migrants as some kind of misguided penance for colonial sins. This creates a perfect split.
It drives polarization.
It forces a clear choice. On one side, you have the so-called clear-sighted defenders of civilization, the readers who agree with Raspail. On the other, the naive liberal humanitarians who are basically painted as traitors.
So the book channels just as much anger against internal enemies as the external ones.
Which is a classic and very effective political tactic. The sharp contrast between the grotesque other and the self-parodying West creates what you might call a Manichaean world.
Meaning a world of absolute black and white. Good versus evil, us versus them.
Exactly. And once you're inside that rhetorical universe, any moderate position, any humanitarian stance on immigration becomes intellectually impossible to even hold. There's no third option.
So now we get to the argument itself, the logos. The book is basically structured as a thought experiment. How is that experiment set up to guarantee its own conclusion?
Well, on the level of logic, the structure is profoundly reductive. It's a closed syllogism, really.
Okay, break that down for us.
Premise 1. Western identity requires rigid, defended borders. Premise 2. The West has lost the moral will to defend those borders.
Conclusion. Therefore, the West must collapse when it meets any determined outside force.
And the whole narrative is just the playing out of that conclusion. It's not an exploration. It's a demonstration.
How does the plot itself make sure that's the only possible outcome?
Every single plot point is arranged so that compromise or any kind of humane policy either fails spectacularly or is made to look absurdly weak.
So any politician who tries to negotiate
is instantly overwhelmed and disgraced. Any church leader who preaches charity is portrayed as a self-loathing masochist. The narrative just steers you, forces you, toward the idea that anything short of bloody resistance is suicide.
So the cards are completely stacked.
The author dealt the cards to validate a political conclusion, not to genuinely test an idea. For instance, you never see a single migrant with a complex inner life or a compassionate Westerner who is also strong and effective.
It's all built on these sweeping generalizations.
Entirely. The migrants are one undifferentiated mass driven by primal survival instincts, and Westerners are all either decadent and guilty or naively altruistic. The lack of individual stories is maybe the strongest part of the structural dehumanization.
It really shows that narrative structure is itself a form of argument. And if you appreciate the way we break down an author's strategy, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments. We offer AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all meant to inspire reflection and rational thought.
And to give that argument even more weight, Raspail anchors it in very old narrative traditions.
How so?
He draws heavily on biblical apocalyptic themes. I mean, the title itself, The Camp of the Saints, is an allusion to the Book of Revelation.
And he also taps into those older European barbarian invasion stories.
He does. And that framing elevates the event. It's not just a modern political crisis anymore. It becomes this end times test of whether the West still believes in itself enough to survive.
So we have the ethos from literary style, the pathos from disgust and rage, and a logos built to force one conclusion. What does this all mean for the book's life after 1973? How did this fiction bleed into real-world politics?
Its influence has been, well, immense and pretty chilling. In contemporary politics, the book has become a foundational text for white nationalist circles and hardline anti-immigration figures.
And they don't read it as a fictional warning.
No, they cite it as being prophetic. The political reception just completely strips away the literary framing and embraces the civilizational dread at its core. It's treated as fact.
It becomes a proof text for the ideology.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is the critical link. Later on, far-right ideologues explicitly connect the novel's scenario to the Great Replacement theory.
For those who might not know that theory.
It's the conspiracy theory that native European populations are being systematically replaced by non-European migrants. Raspail's novel was essentially transformed into a core political myth about demographic conquest.
So the book's imagery and its zero-sum framing fed directly into extremist narratives about white genocide.
Correctly.
It really shows you the power of narrative. The book's whole design, using ethos for credibility, pathos for disgust, and logos to force a conclusion, it's a perfect blueprint for how political fear is constructed through story.
It is.
And the key for us, as readers, is to recognize when a narrative's logic is rigged, when it's built to validate a prejudice rather than to actually test an idea, recognizing that that's your intellectual power.
Which brings up a final important question. If an author successfully uses real literary brilliance to make an extreme political view seem inevitable, does that success make the writing more dangerous or just more effective at its dark purpose? That's something for you to consider.
If you found this expanded format valuable, we encourage you to click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share this discussion, purchase via the link if you wish to read it for scholarly purposes, and always think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.